By 1920, the trees were gone, and so was Charlie. Ratcliffe, Texas had burned bright and fast, like so many East Texas boomtowns. For a brief moment, it was a place where fortunes were made, and mostly in pine. Generations of tall trees fell swiftly to the hungry saws of steam-powered mills. And Charlie Henderson? He was right in the thick of it. This is Finding Grandpa Charlie, a true crime family mystery told in fragments, memories, and stories passed down like campfire tales. I'm Erv Lenzy, and today we're digging into perhaps the most pivotal chapter of Charlie's long disappearance, his years in Houston County, Texas. In the 1910 census, Charlie Henderson is listed in Houston County, working as a laborer in the sawmill industry. He's not a landowner. He doesn't even have his own farm. He is a renter, and that tells us something important. Charlie was living in worker housing, almost certainly one of the many temporary or company-owned structures built near a major sawmill like the one at Ratcliffe. Now, the 1910 census doesn't specifically name Ratcliffe, and that matters. It lists them in rural Houston County. So while Ratcliffe is where my grandfather was born, and it gets referenced a lot in family stories, it's likely that Charlie and Henrietta lived on the edge of town, maybe near Shawnee Prairie, Kennard, or the now extinct settlement of Ivory. All of those were within a short ride of the sawmill, and all of them had working class renters. Many of them had segregated housing, specifically for black laborers. Black communities in East Texas, especially in logging regions, were often tight-knit, resilient, and deliberately excluded from the center of town life. Black sawmill workers were typically housed in separate, under-resourced camps on the outskirts of the main operations. These were not neighborhoods in the traditional sense, but often clusters of shanties and tar paper cabins near the tree lines and rail spurs. Despite poor living conditions, these communities had churches, schools, and mutual support systems. Their presence is part of the true foundation of the region, even if they were ignored in most official records. Henrietta herself spoke of growing up on or near a Native American reservation in Indian Territory, what we now call Oklahoma. The stories she passed down to my grandmother painted a picture of a blended heritage, a life split between native roots and southern hardship. She came to Texas as a young woman, picking cotton and living in camps, like the ones near Ratcliffe. Her presence there is one of the few things we know for sure. At the turn of the century, Ratcliffe wasn't just busy, it was booming. The Central Coal and Coke Company, it's an interesting name, of Kansas City had moved in around 1901, but quickly built what was, at the time, the largest sawmill in Texas. The 4C Mill, as it was called, processed thousands of logs a day. The town swelled with workers, many of them fresh off the train and looking for a paycheck. It was the Wild West, but not of horses and gunfights, of axes and steam. The sawmill roared day and night. Giant bandsaws screeched and sang. Steam hissed from valves and belts that turned endlessly. Smoke poured from towering stacks, and the ground shook under the rhythmic pound of machinery. And the smell, well, the smell was unmistakable. If you've never been to what we call the piney woods of East Texas, let me try to take you there. I spent a portion of my childhood there living with Granny Henderson. The air smells like Christmas all year long. That pine scent permeates everything. And it doesn't matter how poor you are. The smell makes you feel like the world is clean. The air itself feels alive with the scent of evergreen. I imagine it smelled much the same in 1910. Pine needles crushed underfoot, sap and sawdust mixed into something sharp and sweet that clung to your clothes and settled into your skin. But Ratcliffe was more than just sawdust and sweat. It was a company town. Workers were paid in company money, redeemable only at company-owned stores. There were no paved boulevards, only plank sidewalks and muddy roads. Saloons lined the main street. Violence wasn't rare, neither was drinking or gambling. In fact, it's easy to imagine Charlie right at home there, a gambler in a town that never slept. The timber industry in Ratcliffe was so deeply tied to the railroads. These weren't the big trains that you'd see steaming across the prairies. These were smaller, specialized rail lines called logging spurs. They branched out from the main tracks deep into the pine forests. Logging crews would cut down towering pines, load them onto rail cars, and send them rumbling towards the sawmills. Once processed, lumber from Ratcliffe found its way into the homes and buildings of cities across Texas. Places such as Galveston, Houston, Dallas, and beyond. Railroads weren't just essential for logging, they also connected Ratcliffe to other booming industries, especially oil. While Ratcliffe itself never experienced an oil boom, its proximity to rail lines made it strategically important. Those same tracks that hauled logs out of the forest could easily transport heavy drilling rigs, pipes, and equipment into areas where oil had been discovered. This created a natural transition for workers in the area. Men like Charlie, who spent their days in the sawmills or logging camps doing difficult, dangerous jobs, often became ideal candidates to work in the oil fields. They were already familiar with risky labor and long, grueling days. When the logging jobs started to dry up, the oil companies knew exactly where to find tough, seasoned workers who weren't afraid of hard work or danger. But like all boom towns of the Old West and the New West, Ratcliffe couldn't last forever. By 1920, decades of relentless logging had stripped the land bare. Once lush forests now lay as fields of stumps and underbrush. Without trees to feed the mills, the town quickly began to empty. Workers left for new opportunities. Some moved on to the oil fields, others drifted elsewhere in search of steady work, and Ratcliffe, the bustling heart of the piney woods, quieted. The great cut was over, leaving behind only echoes of industry and empty promises. A few years ago, I found something I didn't expect, a birth certificate. And I'm going to be honest, I quickly filed it away into Charlie's profile on ancestry.com, and there it sat for a very long time. And I didn't realize I had filed it there, and I don't even remember putting it there. But I recently, when I was getting ready to prepare for this podcast, I went back through and I took a look at everything on Charlie's profile there. And I found that birth certificate again, and it's not his. It's a birth certificate dated August 23rd, 1912. A baby girl born to Henrietta Waters and Charlie Henderson in Ratcliffe. Now, that's important because it's one of the few times that Henrietta's maiden name is referenced on a document that was likely information provided directly by her, possibly Charlie, and not somebody else. And that's a topic for a future podcast. But no later record of this child has ever been found. I don't remember Grandma ever mentioning her. She wasn't part of the family stories. And it only says baby Henderson on the birth certificate. So she didn't appear in the 1920 census. She wasn't buried next to Henrietta. She's probably buried, if she died, in an unmarked grave. So yes, it's possible she just died. It's possible that she was given up for adoption. And the sad part of this story is it's also possible that Henrietta was alone when she gave birth, because it's likely that by that date on the birth certificate, August 23rd, 1912, Charlie was already gone. In the 20th century, adoptions, especially in rural communities, weren't always formal. Some were handled through churches or extended family networks. Others happened quietly, and sometimes with the child taken in by another family, no paperwork is ever filed. For women like Henrietta, left without a husband and facing the burdens of multiple children, giving up a baby wasn't uncommon. It was an act of desperation, an act of survival. Henrietta had lost not just her husband, but her future. The baby girl may have been born into a world already unraveling. And if that child was handed off or died young, it meant that Henrietta endured something that no census document can truly measure. Grief. Grief not just for the man who vanished, but for the child she could not keep. And Charlie was already gone. He had faked his death in Liberty and fled East Texas. This wasn't just the moment that Charlie disappeared. This was the moment that Henrietta was left behind. In the last episode, I told you that I went looking for Charlie and didn't find him. It was a bit of a fib. I mean, I did find Bachelor Charlie. Remember when I said I found him in 1910, and I found him twice? There's Bachelor Charlie, which is what I call Charles Newton Henderson, who was living at home with his father in 1910. And then there is my Charlie Henderson, married to Henrietta in 1910. They weren't in the same county like I thought they were. I took a closer look at that. I need to correct myself. But they were very close and within not very, very long, like within a couple of weeks of each other, I think. But that was a shocker. The internet says that Charles Newton, who I call Bachelor Charlie, that he got married on June 12th, 1912, in Potter County, Texas. That's Amarillo. That's West Texas. That's about 500 miles away from Ratcliffe. Then in 1913, he had a son with that new wife, a son named Mike. Mike died about 25 years ago, but he also appears to have abandoned his father and moved away sometime after 1930 to Indiana. And the other kids, I don't have enough time to review all this in one podcast. So let's pause a second and take this in. While Henrietta was giving birth to a daughter in Ratcliffe, Charlie had faked his death and was already starting a second family across the state. Whatever happened between them, whatever decisions were made, Charlie was either gone or soon would be. And not just gone. He was rewriting his life. And he wasn't really doing all that good of a job. In 2001, I found myself sitting in a computer lab at a community college in Galveston County. The room smelled faintly of toner, printer paper, and warm electronics. And me, I was broke, newly married and trying to scrape by on a part-time job while finishing a graphic arts degree. Late afternoons in the lab were usually quiet, just the hum of those old retro 90s computers and the occasional student shuffling in and out. It was around this time that Family Search released fully indexed census records, something completely new to genealogists back then. Before, searching meant scrolling through page after page of blurry microfilm. Now, suddenly, anyone's name could be found with a simple keystroke. And remember, I told you about this in one of my previous podcasts. On a whim, maybe boredom, or maybe curiosity, I typed in the name Charles Henderson and hit enter. I remember staring at the screen, half expecting to find nothing, half hopeful I'd finally uncover a piece of the puzzle. Then there it was, Charlie Henderson. I found him as a baby in 1880, and then I searched for his father, finding his father in 1900. And then I found Charlie, the same Charlie Henderson, living in two locations at once, with his father listed as single and with my great-grandmother listed as married with kids. It was a moment that shifted the entire story, a twist I hadn't seen coming. The story I'd heard my whole life suddenly felt incomplete and fractured somehow, waiting for someone to piece it back together. But even with all these discoveries, there were still limits. In 2001, DNA testing wasn't the powerful genealogical tool it is today. There were no definitive tests linking Bachelor Charlie to Grandpa Charlie. There was no way to be certain that these two seemingly separate lives belonged to the same man. Yet faced with the evidence and the gaps it created, I made a decision. I chose to accept the connection even without definitive proof. Proof I may never find, given the limits of documentation in the late 18 and early 1900s. So I adopted Charles Newton Henderson into my family tree, and I embraced Robert A. Henderson as my ancestor. And with that decision, the scattered pieces of the story finally began fitting together. So Charlie vanished from Henrietta's life around 1912, the same year that baby girl was born, the same year he married someone else. By 1920, the sawmills were drying up. Ratcliffe had been deforested, and Henrietta had remarried a man named Mercer. The baby girl was gone, and Charlie was already 5 to 10 years deep into a second life no one back home knew much about. But the cracks in that new life showed early.
In 1993, I was 17, still a teenager, but already deep into genealogy, obsessively so, filling out family group sheets while most kids were playing video games. That was the year the 1920 U.S. Census was released to the public, April 1st, just months before I found myself pouring through it like it was scripture. We'd known Charlie in 1900. We'd seen him in 1910. But 1920, that was the dark spot, the gap, the year no one could account for. I remember scanning the names with a kind of nervous hope. This was it. This was the record we had never had. By then, Charlie would have been around 40 years old, a man in his prime, old enough to be settled, old enough to be found. But that year, something changed, or maybe just became visible. So the trail goes cold, and for nearly a decade I filed this with all the other cold cases every detective collects. Henrietta dies in 1938, buried in Polk County. The children marry, move on. And Charlie? He lingers. Not in photographs, but in ledgers, in census lines and sawmill paybooks. But for all the whispers and speculation, the truth remained out of reach until the light of a screen changed everything. Back in the computer lab in 2001, I searched the 1920 census for Charlie, and there he was. In the 1920 census, Charlie surfaces again, this time far from Ratcliffe, living in Potter County, Texas, with a new wife named Marie Josephine and 2 children. The discovery was shocking. It revealed that even as Henrietta struggled alone, raising their children back in Ratcliffe, Charlie had quietly begun another life hundreds of miles away. This second family posed more questions than answers. Who was this woman, Marie Josephine? What had drawn Charlie to Amarillo, away from the piney woods? And most hauntingly, had Charlie truly abandoned Henrietta and their children forever? Or did he plan, at least in his own mind, to return one day?
In the 1930 census, his second wife, Marie Josephine, was listed as divorced. She was working as a housekeeper, living with one of their daughters. They had 3 kids, a son and 2 younger daughters. Charlie was not living anywhere nearby. He was living alone, boarding in a stranger's house, working in the oil fields as a rig builder with his son Mike. A surprising twist, I did find 3 kids. Remember what I just said? But the middle child, the one born between Mike and little Bobby May, was completely missing from the records. No census entry, no obituary, no marriage license, just a gap, an empty space where a life should be. And it raised even more questions about what and who he left behind. Then in 1938, Marie, Charlie's second ex-wife, dies. She was just 46 years old. Her youngest daughter wasn't old enough to be on her own, and of course Charlie wasn't stepping up. Charlie never appeared again in public records as her husband. He never remarried. He was never listed with children ever again. He never reclaimed the family he'd built after Henrietta. And then something strange happens. And guys, in this story, every time I find an answer, I find 3 more questions. Just when the trail went cold, a lawyer shows up in the late 50s or early 60s looking for Charlie's heirs, claiming that Charlie only recently died. Thanks for joining me today on Finding Grandpa Charlie. If you're enjoying this journey, please follow or subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen, and consider leaving a review or rating. It truly helps others discover the story. Be sure to check out our website and social media channels. It should be listed in the show notes. And I'll eventually be sharing photos, documents, and behind-the-scenes details that didn't make it into the episodes. And I also have a number of interviews with my grandma about Charlie and Henrietta that I'm eventually going to share as well. So next time we'll be following Henrietta's likely route from Oklahoma to Texas, 2 marriages and 2 families, and I'm going to speculate some about her true heritage. I'm Erv Lenzy, and I'll see you next time on Finding Grandpa Charlie.